Hey guys, I've got another podcast here with another very interesting guest. I'm speaking to Serge Rokhman today, and I talked to him about something that he's been experimenting with and researching on his own for a long time, and that is flow states. Something that's really interesting to me as well, and something I've experienced through sport. But Serge has sort of different perspectives on what a flow state is and how to achieve such a thing, and we get into that. And he also ties it into sexuality as well, which was very interesting. Yeah, we get, that's what we mostly focus on is flow states and sexuality, but we get into a lot of other stuff in between as well. So check it out. I filmed this one on my laptop, and the frame rate, of course, messed up a little bit, so it's a little stuttery, but it all synced up fine, and I think it turned out great. So big thanks to Serge for talking to me, and yeah, check it out, YouTube or iTunes, and enjoy it. This is me with Serge Rokhman.
It's a state of sort of well-being. It's a state of having no distinction between subject and object, where the regular sort of processes of the mind or habits of thought do not interfere with our functioning. Do not interfere with the functioning of our organism, so that but it is also a state where we can use our capacities at their optimal level. So it's not just a state of well-being, like of subject and object, but that's what they call it, a state of flow. You just flow like a surfer surfing a wave. And so you don't have to think about it, but generally it happens. It's not something that an unskilled person can do, right? So it involves usually an activity that somebody has put work into, has practiced, like surfing, right? Something like that, where you really have to have a certain amount of time practicing the activity before you can enter the flow state, where you don't really have to think about it, but there's a spontaneous functioning.
Right.
It just flows.
Right. So it's about a performance at some level. It's not just about being in a state of mind, but it's being in a state of mind and doing something as well.
It's not, I wouldn't even say it's a state of mind. I would say it's a state of altered consciousness. And it's a state of body-mind, perhaps, where the mind sort of disappears into the body. Right. So because the action performed is intelligent, yet it's spontaneous and without deliberation.
Right.
Yes.
It's this like making the mind-body connection instantaneous sort of thing. Like
instantaneous. Yeah. There is no
what you're going to do.
There is no filtering. Yeah. You're not thinking about it. There is no filter. You're just flowing.
Right. The way I can relate to it is like my sort of sport that I play is soccer. And so I pretty much play, what really drives me to play is, one, to compete. I like to compete against other young men and whatnot, but also to get into these flow states. And I know I've experienced it before, and it's about being very comfortable. Usually when I'll get into that sort of state, more often it's like mid-season. I'm relaxed. I've been playing for months already. My body's in shape. I'm not thinking about positioning. I'm not thinking about anything. It's all just coming. And it's about really relaxing. That's what I find it is. If I'm going to play my best, I have to be totally relaxed.
Yes. It is about relaxing. That's another aspect of the flow state, is that it comes with a relaxation response. Even though you're at your edge, right? You're generally functioning at your edge. You're pushing yourself to the limits. And it usually does come when there's a certain challenge or a certain risk involved, sometimes the risk of death, right? So you're right there, but it is because there is such a challenge and such a risk that comes with it, with these flow states sometimes, that you can't really deliberate about it, right? The best way to execute an action, to execute a perfect action that's going to be economical, not too much, not too little, but just right, is without thinking about it. Right? Because you're not trying to measure it. You just know. You've done it so many times, and it becomes part of your mind body. It becomes so much part of your system, of your structure of consciousness, even, that it just, when it clicks, it functions spontaneously. You don't have to do anything about it.
So your body has to be trained in whatever movement so that it knows the movements. So you can't get into a flow state when you're learning how to do something.
Right, right. And so these flow states, I mean, they're so important in our life. I mean, think about art, right? Something even like art. We pay artists. We go to see artists who have practiced themselves to the point where they can enter these flow states. So art is a flow state. So when we go watch a concert or something like that.
You're talking about like some sort of performance art.
Yes, yeah, performance
music
art,
or something, yeah.
or sports, right?
Yeah,
we watch
too,
people in a state of flow, and it is when an athlete or an artist is in that state. That's when we kind of go, wow, right? That's what it's about. So they because they also open us to our own states of flow, right? They inspire us, because to me that's really what our system craves. We want to enter these states where the mind doesn't interfere, because we are at our best. We function optimally. We have this sense of well-being, happiness, and we don't have to really think about ourselves. We don't have that Woody Allen character constantly judging what we do. Right. So we're just flowing.
Right. Yeah,
so that's
a sport that I like to watch a lot is like UFC, like mixed martial arts.
I love UFC.
I love watching it.
By the way, I played soccer for a number of years.
Yeah, that's
I was
my
forward.
Two things, pretty much. But so watching the UFC, what I really love about it is it's such a good metaphor for so many things, because it's so simple. It comes down to one man or woman vs another, one-on-one, no extras. It's just you have your body in there, and often what it comes down to is who can reach their peak performance in that moment. And to do that, you have to be relaxed and you have to be confident in all this.
Exactly. And if we talk about it later, you have to be grounded in your death, essentially. I mean, that's kind of a metaphysical or spiritual way of talking about it, because you're out there facing death to a certain degree. And I mean, obviously, you're not going to die. But to me, when we come even to, if we're going to talk about psychedelics, I assume we will, right?
Eventually.
It's again about facing that dissolution of that structure, that inner judge, and sort of facing the flow state. I don't know how else to say it, but facing death to a certain degree, facing that challenge. And I watch UFC. I love UFC too. And it's when a fighter is sort of relaxed and really knows his stuff, right? To me, it's usually the person who wins is the person who is most relaxed, most on point, and also who faces death at a deeper level than the other guy. That's sort of how I view it.
That's interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
We're sort of who can push that extra mile, right? Who can go that extra mile. And you could see sometimes an athlete fades, right? And some athletes or some fighters, they'll just keep going. They'll just keep going no matter what.
Often
and in the worst
breaking
situation, yes.
You see, and a lot of the time, like some of these, not a lot, but some of them, they really talk to their opponent during a fight. They'll really try to get in their head, as they say, and they'll really try to bring them down. Yeah. To try to break. And sometimes you can see it when the other guy breaks and he just doesn't want it anymore. He wants a way out. He wants to quit. And that's like this mental battle.
It's a mental battle. Yes.
And another guy who really, I think, achieves these states of flow quite well is Conor McGregor, who's new.
I love Conor McGregor.
He seems to just be on point as far as knowing how to perform at his best under the most pressure at the peak of these huge fights that he's in now, in front of tons of people, with all this pressure of his country, Ireland behind him, and all this. He's able to break his opponents and just be super confident and collected in there.
Yes. Yeah. He is super confident. He's collected. That's what I call he's grounded into his death. He's grounded. He's in that, he can enter that flow state, better than the other guy.
Right.
And for longer.
Down to fear too, whether it's the fear of death or just the fear of failure or something, you have to be willing to sacrifice whatever it is. Yeah. I've heard other fighters talk about that they go in with the mentality that if they die, they're going to die fighting, or they're okay with that possibility. You have to be okay with it first in order to risk it all, to really go to your peak.
Exactly. And face that fear, not to not to try to manage it or transcend it, but to like feel it, go into it, and use the fear as the fuel for your performance, for the energy that you're going to need to face your opponent. Yeah, and to me, that's a flow state. Flow states exist when there is considerable anxiety. Generally, they show up, as far as the research goes, is when there is some fear and anxiety and quite a bit of a challenge or a risk involved. Those kinds of circumstances seem to bring up the flow state much more than when you're just asked to perform, but the stakes are not that high.
Right. Because you can become, like, I'm thinking about maybe someone, say, working in a factory who has worked there for 20 years or something, and their body completely knows what to do or whatever. I'm just thinking, assembly line, they're taking one thing, doing something to it. And I mean, I don't know if you'd call that a flow state or not, if they're completely not thinking about what they're doing, and they're doing it efficiently as well because they've been doing it so long. But there's no risk or anything.
Efficiency is another key word. Yeah, there is no risk. It's not that there's always a risk, but risk tends to bring it out.
Right, to bring out that maximum sort of potential.
Yes, because with risk, you often either have to perform efficiently, optimally, or you sometimes die. Right. Because extreme sports is all about that. All sorts of extreme sports.
Right.
So.
And
yes.
If you think about like folks going into battle in the olden days or something, achieving this sort of flow state where you are at your most capable is going to be it's going to be the difference between living and dying when it comes down to fighting someone with a sword or something like that. So you can see how it's been sort of, people have been adapted to achieve these states when stress is at a high level, because you need to perform at your best when it matters most.
Absolutely.
And so what do you think now psychedelics have to offer when it comes to these types of flow states? I mean, we talked about fear, and one thing I know is that things like magic mushrooms or whatever can help get over fears and anxieties and help deal with some of these types of things. But how else can they help in flow states?
Yeah, well, there are several ways, a couple of ways at least, that I can answer that. And one way is to kind of bring up the science of the psychedelic science of what's going on in the brain when psychedelics are involved. And that is, we can talk about the default mode network, which is kind of the seat of the ego, the physiological seat of that thinking brain, thinking mind. Thinking mind's a better term. And what psychedelics do so well from that perspective is that they dissolve or they deactivate that default mode network. They're very good at deactivating the parts of our brain that are involved in sort of habitual thought, distracted thought. And so when we're tripping on psychedelics, journeying, or whatever you want to call it, the experience. Yeah. Then we can. There is the capacity to enter those states of flow because the default mode network is deactivated, because the ego is dissolving, right? So that's so the one way that I wanted to mention is that default mode network.
Are you talking about it as if by taking the psychedelic, whatever it is, you're able to achieve a flow state while you're on it, or something that helps you achieve it in the future?
While you're on it.
Okay.
It helps you. It also will help you achieve it in the future, but indirectly, probably by changing your brain chemistry, right? By changing your physiological.
What substance and what dose.
Right. And when I'm talking about psychedelics, I'm usually talking about tryptamines. I mean, I would say phenethylamines do the same thing. Can do something very similar. I mean, their effect in the brain is different. But when I talk about psychedelics, I actually want to talk about tryptamines more than psychedelics, because tryptamines do really dissolve that physiological substrate of the ego structure in the default mode network.
So tryptamines are. Can you give a few examples of what tryptamines are for people?
Tryptamines are DMT, psilocybin, right? Psilocybin is usually converted to psilocin in the body. So that's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, everyone knows, which is NN-DMT. Although NN-DMT is not as far as I understand, in terms of the research and experientially, it's not as potent or it's not as effective in dissolving this default mode network or this ego structure as the others. And I'm talking about 5-MeO-DMT,
right.
5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. So those are the guys, and I think most those are the chemical substances. Most people who know psychedelics are familiar with those.
So when you're talking about achieving a flow state on a psychedelic, like you wouldn't be smoking DMT and then doing something physically challenging, would you?
Yeah, you could be, depending on the dose and depending on what you're doing. So we're entering this territory, right? We can. There's a way to do psychedelics for say reasons of having an insight into yourself and having spiritual experiences and or recreationally. There's all sorts of ways of using these, but this particular way that I am using it, or that I'm talking about, that I am describing, is not generally talked about. Right.
So you just actually,
and I mean, there are instances, I remember the famous pitcher, I don't remember his name, who pitched a perfect game on LSD.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I'm talking about. But of course, he didn't have so much LSD that he couldn't function.
There's a dose.
There's a dose. So it's dose dependent. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to psychedelics, you can take too much, and you wouldn't be able to perform on too much.
Right.
But you can take also an amount that, there's a spectrum here. Some people microdose every day. And they see sort of the positive effects on their mind-body functioning in their regular sort of everyday life by just taking microdoses, right? And there's Reddit forums and all sorts of stuff going on about that. And so there's a spectrum. Then you could take a bit more and do sports or do something else. It's really an uncharted territory here right now. Right. And so if we get into it, right, the way I talk about these things is, and the way it happened in my life, is that I had used these flow states that were brought about by psychedelics for the purpose of relational and sexual intimacy.
Right. You talk a lot about that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can take that. We can talk about that later.
I do want to get into that, but maybe just let's flow states
I just wanted to mention that so that this is why I am personally talking about that. Right. That is why it is important to me that they psychedelics, tryptamines, and some phenethylamines. I don't know. Sometimes I don't pronounce that word right. I have an accent, Yeah. And so it's tryptamines mostly that have allowed me to enter those states while I was, while I'm in a relationship with an intimate partner, and sort of the effects of that and the conclusions I came to about relationships, about flow states, and about tryptamine sort of come from my practice in using these things in intimacy, in relationships.
Right. So I do want to get into that. Let's get into that in a second. I'll bring up just like what came to mind right away when you were talking there was like, you hear about the Vikings taking like mushrooms before battle.
Right. Or you think about Persians. I don't exactly remember what the peoples were historically, but the assassins would take hashish. Right. That's where the word assassin comes from before they would go into battle. So I consider cannabis a psychedelic.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I was going to say was that sometimes also what I didn't mention was that when I play soccer, I will smoke a little bit of marijuana, not all the time, but I really do think it can be a performance enhancer. And it's so funny to me that a lot of the folks, even in the UFC, people have gotten busted for marijuana.
Yeah, Nick Diaz just did.
And then there's all this debate around it. And so many people are like, man, it is not a performance enhancer at all. It shouldn't even be tested for. And I don't think I agree with drug testing in general for sports. So I don't think that's a whole other issue. But I
Yes.
do think that marijuana can be a performance enhancer. And one of the main things is the dose. Dose is huge. If I smoke a little, I don't even smoke. I vaporize my marijuana now. This is the 2015 here, but so I do a tiny bit of that, and I take a very small amount. Like I'm not. If I the downsides specifically for me, if I use marijuana before soccer and I do too much, my mouth gets dried out, like my lips get super dry, and I end up drinking too much water, and my stomach gets messed up, and then my eyes get dried out too, and it has a detrimental effect at a certain point. But basically, mostly I find that with the right dose, specifically to getting into these flow states, marijuana can be really helpful. It helps me totally relax when I'm performing and get out of my own head and just let go a little more.
I agree, and I don't quite know what the science behind it is, but it seems to me that they do something very similar to what the tryptamines do. I have a similar cannabis, marijuana has a similar effect on me when I'm doing all sorts of activities, and yeah, getting the mind out of the way. That's what's important there.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So we can get into now talking about the sexual. So I guess sexual performance and sort of connection to the other person, and I guess it's sort of achieving a flow state together is sort of what you're talking about. Right?
That's what I'm talking about. There's so many things that we can actually really get into here from so many different angles. Right. We could talk about sometimes I talk about the psycho-integrative effects of psychedelics. There's this notable researcher in the field of psychedelics. His name is Michael Winkelmann, and he talks about psychedelics as being psycho-integrators. That what they do in your body, in your nervous system, is that they integrate the various parts of the brain, right? So they integrate the brain top down, left, right hemispheres, and so there's this integration and a greater connection within the brain itself.
Okay, yeah.
That allows us to. For me, that's what kind of sort of allows us to enter these flow states. But this can also happen not only within our own energetic system. This can happen between two people as well, where inside ourselves, psychedelics can help us integrate our energy system in such a way that everything's sort of functioning cohesively, and everything is congruent with everything else, right? There's because a lot of times what happens is why the default mode network is important. It's this executive control network of the brain where it plays a certain kind of filtering role for contents that come from lower areas of the brain, of mammalian and reptilian brain. Sometimes it is called. In other words, more primitive impulses in our body-mind system, in our consciousness, are generally repressed in some form by this default mode network, by the ego, right? That's another way of saying that. Okay. They're generally suppressed in some form. And so when psychedelics are in our system, one of the things that happens is that default mode network is deactivated, right. Or its activity is reduced, diminished, so that there's greater connectivity and integration between the various systems in the body-mind.
I have heard that they studied, I think that maybe they even scanned brain waves or something, and what they had predicted was going to happen was people take the psychedelic and then all this increased, that you're adding something, so it's increasing everything, and there should be more connections and more. But I think what they found was that it relaxed the brain, and that whatever normal connections were happening were sort of deactivated, and other areas of the brain that don't normally communicate started communicating with each other.
Yes. Kind of yeah. So there are these particular studies that call this type of thing that you're talking about greater connectivity and unconstrained cognition is the word that's used sometimes. Unconstrained cognition, that the network that's responsible for the filtering activity, for the repressing activity, that's the part that is deactivated, that of which the activity is diminished. But but the connections, the various other networks and hubs within the brain, they actually become more connected. Right. And so there's greater integration, so that a lot of our primitive impulses, a lot of our emotional problems, emotional wounds, they can come to the surface and be integrated into the rest of our system. They don't just have to kind of follow whatever they are in our body mind, in our energy system. So something like that can happen also not only inside ourselves, but between two people, because we have now two brains that can integrate and function as a unit instead of just having one brain functioning as a unit. And even though our brain always functions as a unit, it seems sometimes that there are parts of ourselves that are fighting other parts. Like, sometimes the ego is repressing things that really should be looked at and integrated into the rest of ourselves. And so psychedelics help us to integrate that, or tryptamines can help us.
Like, get really specific. Like, you're talking about during intercourse, during sex.
Yes.
Are you talking about?
Okay, let's get to it.
Having sex while you and your partner are on one of these tryptamines?
Yes.
Right.
That's one of the things I'm talking about. I'm talking about.
What does that do for? Like, what does that do in the moment? You just feel. Is it like a sort of telepathic thing on some level?
Well, you've talked to Martin Ball, you've talked to Ollie. Oliver Martin,
right? This
and they talk about non-duality.
Idea, yeah.
They talk about non-duality. So even though I sort of bring these flow states into it, and talk about flow states, and talk about the science of tryptamine dynamics in the brain, what I'm really talking about is non-duality.
Okay.
Right. What I'm really talking about, when the two systems are integrated, and I'm going to try to kind of flesh it out real quick. Mm-hmm. When the two energy systems are integrated of two people, when two people are in these flow states, they are the reason I use, to kind of take a step back, the idea of the flow state is because the things like non-duality and when we talk about all sorts of mystical, metaphysical things, a lot of people recoil at that.
Right, sure, yeah.
A lot of people recoil at that, but people can connect with the science of flow states. People can understand that, right?
Right.
And understand that when we're talking, say, about the experience of God, we don't have to talk about something really transcendent, something really that is so far off that most of us will never experience. That these flow states is actually what, when in my view, when Martin Ball talks about non-duality, or when Ollie talks about non-duality, they're talking about flow states.
Okay.
But just the degrees of awareness of what's going on in that flow state. There are levels of understanding, right? At a certain dose of taking a tryptamine, you might enter a flow state, but you may not be aware that you're communing with God, right? That you are God, or that you are everything. You're not there yet. Taking it a bit further, you could take so much that you're not talking about a flow state anymore. You're talking about experiencing everything and everyone. You're talking about a much larger experience where you could say, I'm having a mystical experience. I'm having a mystical experience of union with everything that is, with God. But if you don't go that far, somewhere in the middle, you could just be in a flow state. Because really, what to me it's all about, it's not about experiencing God. These tryptamines, it's not as important for us as human beings to see God, to know those things, as to become optimally functioning, integrated human beings, which means that we enter states of flow with greater ease over the course of our development. To me, that's what it means to be an integrate whole human being.
So the non-duality idea,
yes,
if anyone hadn't listened to those podcasts, is the idea that we are all not only connected and we are not only all one, but we are all God, right? On some level, whatever God means, that's the kind of idea. So it seems
not all non-dual views would say that you're God.
Okay, right. And maybe use different words, or we're all the universe.
I would say that.
Whatever.
I would say that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when you say, like, by performing in a flow state, you are sort of achieving this on some. It's like it's almost like you're saying by performing in a flow state, you are experiencing God in a way, or experiencing
Yes.
something.
Yes, what
along
I'm
those lines.
saying is that in a flow state, you are channeling the divine nature through your body-mind system. When your ego does not interfere, you have a greater capacity to access your divine nature. And that's what happens in a flow state. That's spontaneous intelligence that sort of acts without you thinking about it. Right. Through your body. To me, that is divinity acting through you. And so even if you haven't experienced the divine and you experienced yourself as God, you can experience the flow states, and most people wouldn't call him that. But we don't really need to go there, because a lot of people will never experience that. That experience is not for everyone, it appears.
It is pretty amazing to experience something like that. Like when I think about the times where I've played soccer, where it's just been like completely in flow, and I won't even be thinking, and there'll be like 4 defenders in front of me, and I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to pass this ball to that guy on the other side, and it'll just somehow make its way through all 4 of them without them touching it. I don't really think about how I'm going to do it, but it just, my foot kicks the ball and it makes its way through somehow. And it's very amazing to experience that.
It's almost as if you're witnessing your own action from a distance, isn't it?
Sure.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like that. And the non-dual traditions talk about the witness. They often will talk about the non-dual state as being the state of just pure witnessing, pure seeing itself. And so that's how I connect the flow states to these non-dual, to the non-dual understanding of reality. And so by making that connection, I'm also trying to say, look, we don't necessarily have to talk about these things in metaphysical terms. We can also kind of bring it more down to earth and say, look, it's just about these flow states, and we are finding out, at least at the cultural level, this is a more acceptable idea, and scientifically speaking, or psychologically speaking, people who do this research, they do talk about human beings as fully functional, integrated human beings are those human beings who are capable of entering these states of flow at greater capacity, than there is that thread emerging,
right.
Yeah.
So back to bringing it back to sexuality and having sex and being in these flow states. What sort of feedback, you obviously, we have our perspective. So if you're in a flow state, you can sort of tell, but then it's your partner is achieving the exact same thing with you at the time. And now even being I've heard, and I've experienced too, marijuana can definitely create great sexual experiences for sure. Marijuana can be awesome for that. But the idea to me, I don't know what tryptamines, you can tell me what you guys are using or whatever if you want, but the idea to me of having sex on mushrooms seems so weird to me. It doesn't seem like I'm not horny when I'm on mushrooms. I feel gross. I'm sweating. I feel queasy.
Right.
And so, but I do know that Terence McKenna would talk about mushrooms being an aphrodisiac and whatnot, which I just never really related to.
Yeah. I don't remember which book it was in. Perhaps it was True Hallucinations, where he talked about taking LSD and taking a large DMT dose while he was with this other woman. He was in India, I believe, or in Nepal, and when he took it. So there was this LSD, they took LSD, and then while they were at the top of the LSD trip, they took DMT.
Oh my God.
And so they ended up having sex, right? And
he talks planned. It was just they both.
It wasn't planned. It wasn't
mood.
planned. So to me, I would say they entered a flow state where their egos moved aside, and whatever was natural for them, for their bodies to do at that moment, as an integrated system. Because reality, for me, Martin Ball also talks about this, is an integrated system. It's an integrated energy system, where it's all God, in other words. And everything is this perfection of all the parts within reality are perfectly geared to sort of mirror and reflect one another. So one things move, another things move. It's this constant self-transformation of constant mirroring. And so when our ego is relaxed, when it's relaxed enough for our true energy, divine energy, to move through us, for us to enter that state of flow, we're not going to think about or experience or judge what we're doing. Right? So sometimes when you reach a certain level of experience on a psychedelic, on a tryptamine, for instance, what I've personally used is magic mushrooms, is psilocybin, and 5-MeO-DMT were my tools for getting to these states while in a sexual relationship. But what say I would do, and I'll bring it back to what I was just talking about, is when I was in that state on a inside a tryptamine experience, I would feel moved, or my partner would feel moved. Instead of me thinking about having sex or doing it, you just feel moved because the energy moves you. You just enter the state of flow, and what comes naturally, that's what you do. Without really thinking about it. There is, and you know it by the fact that your sense of identity is not present. You're not moving from your sense of identity, from your sense of ego. You're moving from something that moves from a much deeper place. I would say you're moving from the heart. Right. You are moved by the heart to engaged in this activity, right, with your intimate partner.
So you're talking about like the fact that you took mushrooms, didn't plan on like, okay, we're gonna take mushrooms and then have sex.
I have this. And sometimes you don't have sex, but you still have experience of non-dual union, where you just understand that the other person, you understand intuitively, you understand at a level that is not egoic, that not at the level of thinking, that you are at that moment one. You just know that you're one with this other person. There's no sense of boundary. There is no sense of self or other. There's just, we are one. We are one unit. And within that, whatever energy arises, it's like two magnets moving towards each other, right? You're not thinking about it. So, and this happened to me with my intimate partners, right? And it doesn't always lead to sex. Sometimes it leads to kind of meeting each other's needs at a level that we normally don't. It could be, touch. It could be, for instance, I have this one case where I'm not, I was thirsty. I was in a trip and I was thirsty, but I didn't even realize I was thirsty. And my partner would bring me water, right at that moment. And then as soon as I drank it, she'd go away, and my hand would extend all by itself. And at that moment, I didn't know she was there. She'd come and pick up the glass, right? I mean, it's little things like that, but they also work on a bigger scale where you seem to be so integrated, so in touch, right? Other people will call it telepathic connection, so in touch with the other person, that you are automatically doing, without thinking about it, you're doing what the situation calls for. Because really, if you are God, if you are this non-dual integrated energy system, then when that sense of identity disappears, then you're just God, how should I say it, meeting God's needs, right? You're just functioning at this level of spontaneous intelligence where you don't have to sort of judge yourself or think about what you're doing. You're just doing it, and it automatically is exactly what the other person needs. So whether that's sexual, whether that's emotional, whether it's something you have to say, but it really does work at that level, and it doesn't appear like it's something that everybody has experienced, but quite a few people, quite a few psychedelic explorers have experienced that, and throughout there are traditions in the East, especially in the East, right? Tantra it sort of talks about things like that. When they talk about, we can get into it, but to me, that's really what they're talking about. They're talking about these states that tryptamines can bring us to easier than all these other tantric practices or things that those folks were doing.
Right. It's a cool idea. This idea of just ultra connectedness, and it's cool as well. Like when you've experienced it, something like that, and it kind of gives you a faith that you wouldn't have normally. To faith that if you just get out of your own way and just continue forward,
yes,
the universe will sort of open up for you in a way, and it'll sort of guide you without you having to decide. I feel like just recently in my life too, I've kind of came to that conclusion where I'm just sort of taking opportunities as they come and just going forward, even if I don't know what sort of end goal is in mind. In sort of like so it's kind of like this flow state idea in sort of a broader sense of just like, I'm not going to be in flow all the time. There's too much bullshit in my life to be in flow all the time. But I mean, by having experienced that and like having this soccer ball seem guided from my foot in a way, it kind of gives me some faith in the universe in general that, you know, other parts of my life will be guided if I just get out of my own way, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of guidance is actually something that I talk about as well when it comes to flow states. Because if reality really is this kind of integrated energy system where everything's perfect and all things sort of reflect one another, you know, where everything's just this large mechanism where
equation that makes sense at the end of the day.
Yeah. So if it really is that, when I talk about flow states, I want to say that when you're in a flow state, you become integrated into the unitary nature of being. You become integrated into this reality in a way that you're functioning in alignment with it. When you're in a flow state, you are aligned with the perfection of reality to such a degree that you can trust that your functioning will be spontaneous, intelligent, efficient, and that it'll be guided. And the reason it will be guided is because if reality is an integrated energy system, then an intelligent system, then it also tries to optimize its experience. In other words, whenever there's say an energetic kink, or so the ego to me is a kind of energetic kink in reality, in experience. It's there for a reason. It's there for a reason. It's an important thing. It's part of the process as well, part of the whole as well. But it interferes with these flow states. What God or reality or whatever you want to call it is attempting to do is it's attempting to optimize its functioning. Just like our organism is attempting to optimize its functioning. So whenever there's an interference from our mind, whenever there's an interference, some sort of a negative pattern, something that prevents the divine energy of love. Again, you got to go back to Martin Ball's and Ollie's podcasts to really. I'm kind of building on those. Right?
yeah, for sure.
And so, whatever preventing that energy from functioning optimally, whatever preventing these flow states from manifesting, reality attempts to iron out those kinks, right? Those wrinkles. And so when we enter those states, we do feel guided because at that point, reality is optimizing its experience. It's sort of aligning everything so it functions cohesively in an integrated fashion as one energy unit. So to take it to a larger perspective, if reality is God, right, then it's constantly attempting to break the boundaries of our egos, even though it has created those egos in the first place. But it's also attempting to break those things down to the level where we all functioning as one integrated unit, right? In other words, where we are not interfering with our experience so that we are treating each other as God through these flow states. And in that way, we actualize our potential. We function optimally all the time, right? We can't do it all the time, but at least to me, this is why tryptamines exist. One of the reasons they exist is to get us to these states where we can function with one another. We can relate to one another in a way that is aligned with the optimal perfection, or with what reality is trying to do, with what God is doing. So in other words, we're treating each other as God. We're treating each other as one. So that, and we do that when we're in a flow state. Best. Right. We do that best when we're in a flow state, because we're not thinking about it. We're just, the other thing about flow states that I forgot to mention, they also find that there's this state of empathy and love when people enter these states. Right? Yeah, really? that's part of the research. Yeah, the state of well-being, kind of this empathy. They're one of the things they're doing is they're teaching like Navy SEALs to enter states of flow.
Right. Yeah.
And they understand. One of the things they noticed is that when they train Navy SEALs to enter the states of flow, or when they train them while they're in a state of flow, then the soldier or the Navy SEAL is learning twice as fast, or something like that, or 5. I don't remember what it is, but it's some ridiculous number where they're learning much faster than they would regularly learn whatever the skill they're practicing. Yeah, but the effect there, well, if they're trying to create a perfect soldier, and then there's these states of well-being and love, it's kind of goes back to the experiments that there's these experiments that the CIA did in like the 60s or 70s, where they try to have soldiers on LSD, fight, and the soldiers would just be loving on one another. They didn't want to fight.
Right. So that kind of points to that connection between flow states and LSD, that if they both do bring about that feeling of empathy. I didn't think about that. I mean, so you would say, like, if you test a surfer who's in flow riding a wave, he feels empathy in sort of a general way, empathy toward the wave?
To me, right, all of these words, empathy, feeling of aliveness, love, they're one and the same. In other words, when it's that feeling of being alive, of being at the top of our game, right? Being in that flow state. I'm at the top of my game. So you feel, people, when they're at the top of their game, they generally feel love.
Right. That makes sense.
Generally, it's like you don't want to hurt another. You don't want to do anything that would be destructive.
I like that idea.
Yeah, because you feel alive. Right, you feel love. To me, those are the same quality. That's the same.
It can be like addicting in a way. Like me playing soccer and whatnot. I want to get to that level. I've just started my indoor season just started last week, and I'm not at the level yet. I haven't played in a while. I'm not in good shape. It's going to take me a while, but after playing once and say not having the great performance, I get so inspired and motivated to just do it, because in order for me to, like, personally, if I want to get to this flow state level of performance, I need to take care of myself. I need to sleep well. I need to eat right. I need to be in peak physical condition. I need to train. I need to play a lot. I need to, etc. I need to have all my sort of ducks in a row in my life in general in order for me to, I feel, to get to that state. And just going back to ego too, you brought up ego, and I've thought about ego a lot. Just sort of in general, because I'm into the psychedelic world a lot now. I'm talking to a lot of psychedelic folks. Ego comes up quite a bit, and so many people bash this ego, and you got to dissolve the ego and all this. And I think about it because on one hand, I really love to compete. Like, I love competing. It's part of why I play soccer as well and do other things. And that's kind of the ego, right? The ego is the competitive driven nature to be the best, or to be better than your competition and whatnot. And I think you were sort of pointing to this in a way where it's like the ego has a role, and it's to get people to a higher level sort of thing. You have to push through it.
Yeah, and I think our energy systems are built in such a way that the ego is supposed to return. We enter these states, we sort of expand, and we expend a lot of energy in these states. And so to me, the ego is almost like a state of rest sometimes. So you kind of get back to your identity and rest in that ego, because it's energetically not as demanding. I mean, it can be energetically very demanding, but in terms of after you've entered a flow state and have expanded so much, generally people don't stay there forever. I mean, even if you would call flow states sort of the states of like enlightenment or something that people talk about, generally the ego always returns.
Right. That's with
yeah,
these
and
psychedelics too.
you get back to baseline. It's sort of the baseline of identity,
right.
the baseline of human experience.
And after these peak experiences, you could call them, you can go back and sort of change, say, your relationship to your ego or your just sort of everyday self, and how you perceive things from that perspective.
Right. And so and generally you've expended so much energy, or you've allowed, through this flow state, you've allowed certain aspects of yourself to flow out, or to come out of or to have like a catharsis experience, right? So that your ego doesn't have to repress all that stuff after it returns, and it may be rearranged in the process, right? Because I mean, there's all sorts of things going on. The ego may be rearranged in the process, so it doesn't have to be so. There's all sorts of things going on there.
So like obviously your area of interest, at least with these psychedelics, is to do with these flow states in different ways. But do you also sort of look at them as healing agents in a way, maybe separate from being in flow states? Because a lot of people call these things medicine and use them to heal physical ailments or mental things, patterns, or destructive kind of behaviors and things like that.
They certainly act as healers, but to me that's of secondary kind of importance. When these flow states are available, when they are in play, what generally tends to happen, the way I talk about it is sometimes I'll use the scientific analogy that we used earlier with and bring up the default mode network. And so I would say that that the ego, the default mode network, and everything involved with that, the frontal cortex, and they repress, they exert a top-down control on the emotional and the more primitive parts of ourselves that are generally a bit more disorganized, a bit more chaotic, that have our wounds within them. I know it's a little abstract, and I'm going to try to kind of bring it back, but there's this digestion of energy. What happens on tryptamines, right, is often people will experience sort of these, before they can enter any kind of transcendent states or a flow state, they will have a hard time with it. Or some people have a hard time. I personally, I've used to have a lot of hard time. I would take a psychedelic, and then there'll be some time of processing and introversion and sort of emotional insight. And then after all of that, I may enter some transcendent state. Right.
Right. Yeah. That does seem to
so
be
to me, in that process, the ego is being digested. It's being metabolized. The energy process going on in the brain, the metabolism that's going on is sort of digesting the ego, digesting those processes. That's what metabolism is, right? It's kind of a process of breaking down energy. And so the energy of the ego is progressively broken down, and so our energy expands and opens. But while that breakdown process, it takes that top-down structure of the ego that represses or deeper nature, that represses the state of flow, that represses or represses our divine nature. And in that process, the ego is also healed because it is dissolved. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that dissolution, that state of dissolution, that process, that hardship, or that phase of sort of psychological pain that some people experience on these states, that is the process of aligning our ego, aligning our natural energy, of digesting our energy and aligning it with divinity.
Right. And
in
so,
that
in
that process, we're healed. Yeah.
Right. So it's almost like one and the same sort of thing.
Yeah. To me, it's a process of realignment and rearrangement.
Right.
Right. Digestion, where we have to metabolize the energy of our ego. And the energy of our ego, right, the way we experience them from the inside is our thoughts or emotions. So all those things are digested.
Right.
Right. They're digested, they're processed, and that energetic process internally we experience as all sorts of, it could be an emotional catharsis, it could be just insight that we have about ourselves, whatever that is, that metabolism is what allows the healing, because it metabolizes those ego structures.
Right. That's a funny way to look at it, like digestion, because it does, like, it seems like you sort of, I could say you can sort of taste it as it's moving through. You sort of get a glimpse into like all these things moving through, whether it's anxieties or things you've been thinking about for a while, and things that are bugging you, and emotions and et cetera. It seems to like move through you, like you say, at the beginning of some of these experiences, and then once you've digested it, once you've processed it, you are opened up to these more divine kind of experiences. And maybe like to achieve, like you're talking about alignment and being in full connection with whatever word you want to say, divinity and all this stuff, and maybe that's sort of, in order to achieve a flow state, you have to get to the state, and then it sort of in turn creates healing, because being aligned properly is obviously going to create healing as a byproduct. Way.
And the ego or that, that which gets metabolized, that's which gets digested, is usually that which is in the way of the flow state emerging, right? This is sort of how I would put it. That is what's in the way, and the healing is the emergence of the flow state. There's something that Martin Ball talks about when he talks about 5-MeO-DMT, is that something that happens when people fully let go of their ego or fully let go into the experiences, they begin to move in symmetrical motion, right? Where the left and the right side of the body, the both sides of the body, they mirror each other and they move in unison. They move as one. And so to me, that's a sort of a flow state, right? That's just an example of something that happens, and I've seen it happen, right? This is something that happens to me when I fully relax into a really powerful psychedelic experience. Is I begin to move in these sort of Tai Chi-like symmetrical movements, and that's one version of the flow state. And so the healing happens. Usually people or their egos are unable to move that way until whatever garbage they're holding inside themselves, whatever emotional wounds, whatever they're holding inside themselves, will not allow them to relax enough into that energy that is coming up to be able to move in that manner.
Right.
So yes, so that's just one example that can be extended to other facets of life, right? So whenever there's something in our ego that's in the way, that is some sort of negative habit, negative pattern of thought or emotion, of attention, it's in the way of our energy moving authentically in life.
Right.
Right.
I think this is something, it seems like people are in general aware of this, and it's like a new sort of phase, new fad these days of like optimization and like performing at your best, being at your best. People are trying to eat healthier food and work out and be in shape, and people want to feel like they're in alignment and they're at their best. They're able to perform.
The funny thing is a lot of that is ego, actually. Trying to fit in, but sort of a self-image. Some of that.
It depends on the motivation, sure. Like there's these, if you get into just bodybuilding for the sake of looking enormous and massive, then that's a little different than trying to be a performer, trying to be someone who can perform well.
Yeah. Well, we're all so different, and there's so many differences in our motivation and why we do things. Then yes, so some of it is ego, some of it is just people actualizing themselves.
Right, but it is something.
What is authentic for them.
It's a fine, I think, goal. Like, just imagine if these type of flow. Basically, when we say flow state, we're talking about optimal performance in whatever way. If we could do that at least more often than once a month or whatever the hell whenever you can get it, that would be amazing, right? And it's sort of something we all chase, I think, and it's often we're distracted by emotions, and we get angry, and then we get whatever it is, we make bad choices that relate to other things. We try to make this more specific, like I wake up tired and I have to go to work, and I come home tired, and then I I can't get into any kind of good performance when I'm totally distracted and I just want to eat crappy food and relax on the couch and watch TV and da 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 da. But the goal being not to have that. The goal being not to be tired and distracted and not performing, not doing what I actually want to do. But I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, right? I mean, we interfere with our energy. We interfere with the functioning of our organism that would just function spontaneously if we would just get out of the way. We would be in these flow states. I mean, we're not meant to be there all the time, at least not yet. I don't know, maybe we'll evolve to that level. Right. Maybe machines will replace us. I have no idea.
So you don't think that's something we should be in all the time, these flow states? It's more of
but more often than not. Yeah, when we need to. And when I talk about relationships function best when they function in flow states. Because we get all of our ego stuff out of the way, all of our ego shit, all of the garbage. We're not paying attention to the internal activity of our ego, of our mind, of our identity, sort of coming up with all these stories about how to relate, about this image of myself or image of the other, and all the things that we imagine when we relate to one another, all the projections. When those are not in the way, we're generally in a flow state.
Right. A lot of it is it's this idea of getting things out of the way.
Getting out of the way. And so with relationships, that is very important. And most people don't function at that level. Very rarely. And when they do, there's the state of intimacy, like, between partners, between intimate partners, when they enter a state of intimacy where everything just seems to flow.
Right. That's something even McKenna talked about, like psychedelics aside, kind of talked about just sex itself being sort of a psychedelic state of mind, because you do become so connected. I mean, not all sex, but I mean, good sex, I guess, when you are really connected to someone, it is sort of this, I don't know what you call it, maybe not out of body experience, but just sort of it's more of a, I guess, I don't know, sort of a flow state, but you're sort of a witness in a way, and I don't know, you're operating together in that sort of state.
Yeah. Well, sexuality, right? Sexuality, when we're talking about sexuality, to me, we're talking about like this pleasure dimension of bliss, right? Like there are tantric traditions that would talk about bliss, and to me, bliss and flow state is sort of they're describing the same quality, right? When we're really in a flow state, there is a sense of pleasure, right? That's what I mean by the state of well-being.
It'll feel good to be.
Yeah, you feel good.
Right. But sex is so funny because not everyone like looks at sex as some kind of like ultra connection performance kind of thing. People are so weird about sex, and there's so much weird like horniness around such weird, goofy things nowadays.
Yeah, there's a lot of interference from the ego. There's a lot of garbage. There's a lot of distortion, right? In other words, we have a natural sexual energy, natural sexual expression that is sort of intrinsic to all of us. These human bodies are sexual.
Right.
They just are. And to again, when we come back to the ego or to all sorts of negative emotional patterns, a lot of our energy, sexual energy, heart energy, it gets distorted by these negative patterns that are part of our conditioning as human beings, right? Part of our upbringing, whatever it is.
Right.
And so we don't generally get the authentic expression of sexuality. We usually get sexuality through some sort of distorted lens.
Sure.
Where
it's hard to be authentic when you've been repressed for so long. There's been a lot of repression around sexuality.
Yes, that's why it's good to see sexuality in a state of flow where there is no repression.
Right.
Where there is no sort of negative thought patterns, when there is no distortion.
Right.
In sexuality, so how it functions, and generally what you see is there is when people are in that flow state and they're having sex, when the sexuality is flowing, it's not about performance. It's not about how long or how fast you do it.
Right.
It's not about performance.
More.
It's about connection. Right. It's about intimacy. It's about heart-to-heart connection. And again, if we talk about the non-dual perspective, the sensations in my body mirror the sensation in my partner's body, so that I am so deeply in touch with myself and with my partner that I am able to follow that energy in such a way that we mutually open each other. We mutually open each other to deeper intimacy. And so our sexuality is not, it's not goal-driven.
Right.
Yeah. And if we simply follow those sensations in the body, that natural energy, when it expresses itself without distortion, when we don't think about it with our mind, it's just spontaneous. It's a dance, right? It's a spontaneous flow. There's nothing. If you just follow the energy, then you cannot get it wrong, right? And if both partners are in that state,
and you can't predict it or make a game,
and you can't predict it. Yeah, sometimes it could be sometimes it could be rough, sometimes it could be less rough, you know, gentle, very gentle. It's just whatever the energy, the arousal of energy at the moment demands or wants to do. And so you're just one flow. I call it, you're just one flame when you're doing that, right? So you don't, there is no like, what do you want or what do I want? You just know. Right? You just know, because you're so deeply connected. And like I said, you don't even have to talk about it in terms of non-duality, although that is the way I like to talk about it. You could talk about it in terms of two energy systems becoming so integrated into one another that they function as one unit. In non-dual terms or in mystical terms, you can have one flame, one heart. Right.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, well, I don't have that much time actually now, so I want to get into something else before we end. I want to talk about this idea of a spiritual emergency. Can you tell me, in your words, what you think that is, or what that means to you?
You know, that used to be an interest of mine before I really dove deep into psychedelics. That is a term coined, or at least used, by Stan Grof, Christina Grof, and they use that for any type of situation where the breakthrough of this energy that we're talking about is so great, so powerful, that it disrupts the functioning of the individual, psychological and social functioning. So there could be, like, say, schizophrenia emerging, or the individual just cannot function in society, or cannot function in some way, because they have to constantly deal with the breakthrough of this energy that breaks through so powerfully in the individual that they suffer. They're suffering in some form. And generally these folks need guidance of some sort, or need a period of time away from normal social functioning or psychological functioning for them to integrate the energy into their life. So generally this was talked about in terms of Kundalini experiences, Kundalini awakening.
Right, yeah, I've heard that.
I'm not, I like I said, I tend to bring everything down to terms of energy and states of flow. So to me, it's just a spiritual emergency is when, for one reason or another, these mechanisms that protect us from always being in a state of flow, in that divine state of union, they begin to break down, and the individual attempts to repress those or control them, or doesn't know what's happening. Just doesn't know what's happening and why it's happening. It could be triggered by a variety of things. It could be triggered by, an injury. It could be triggered by psychedelics. It could be triggered by whatever. And for Christina Grof, if anybody wants to look it up, it was triggered by her labor. She was in labor, and she began sort of to experience this kind of blissful union with the divine, and after that, for a while, she was sort of even after she gave birth, I believe she was suffering because she couldn't control these states that would just come.
Really?
They would just come. Yeah, a person can become so open with psychedelics as well. I mean, this has happened to me on occasion where a powerful experience would trigger days or weeks of spontaneous experiences that would just occur out of nowhere, and all you could do at that moment, you could be in the middle of some activity or some work or whatever. Generally it doesn't happen that way, but you could be just doing your day-to-day stuff, and suddenly you find yourself in this state, and in a full-blown psychedelic state.
I've heard others talk about that, and it's something that seems so out there, like for that to happen, that it's hard to believe fully. I guess until you've experienced it. I heard I think it was David Cho. I think do you know him? He's an artist, graffiti artist, I think.
Yeah, that is a familiar name.
But he's talked about that. I think he had used DMT maybe a few times, and then just found that he would just randomly sort of be seeing and feeling these altered states of consciousness around him, and it's very interesting. He says he sees it very constantly, like very often.
Yeah. Well, when you look deeper at the experience, even of some people you've interviewed before, right? Martin has a biography autobiography he wrote called "Being Infinite." It was happening to Martin,
right.
Where he would enter. I don't want to speak for him, but he would enter these states spontaneously after having taken 5-MeO-DMT.
Right.
And eventually for him, he would say it led him to sort of a complete giving up of the ego.
Right.
But for me, it has happened through a relationship. I was in a relationship with a woman, if I may kind of tell a little bit of a personal story. I was in a relationship with a woman with whom I was engaged in this practice of psychedelic practice of intimacy, for lack of a better word. And what the relationship didn't work out, but I would enter with her into these states. And after the relationship ended, I seemed to feel so deeply merged with this woman that the grief that I was experiencing was a sort of a spiritual emergency for me, because I would have psychedelic states come in moments of intense grief. I would be convulsing in grief in a psychedelic state, in an open, sort of transcendent experience of union, but at the same time, that state was brought about by intense grief. And so to me, that was a spiritual emergency for me, because for several months I had to figure out what to do with this grief, because it would just spontaneously come. And it's like my system was so attached or so integrated with this person that through grief I would experience this unitary energy, this and this was a spiritual emergency for me, because I could not function for several months. I was bedridden, experiencing grief, and so what I found out is that I really had to feel that grief and go really deeply into it. Eventually, it sort of subsided, but I had to release and cry a lot, and I had a lot of help from individuals who have had similar experiences. Yeah, and so that's what I mean by spiritual emergency. That sometimes there's the openings are so big, and then some event triggers something that is very difficult for the individual to integrate by themselves. Right. And so that would be a spiritual emergency in my view. I
spoke to one other guy on this podcast. It was a while ago now. His name is Kevin Parker, and he actually just organized a conference on Vancouver Island about psychedelics in psychotherapy that I attended. And he talked to me on the podcast and at this conference about his own spiritual emergency, as he called it, when he was, I think, 18 or 19 years old, and was, I think, admitted to some kind of facility. I don't know if it was a mental institution or whatever, for some kind of schizophrenia. And he was administered some kind of antipsychotic medication he took for a long time. And it just, it seems like it's possible that this seems like another way we could maybe look at schizophrenia and what that is and what people are going through.
Yes.
And it seems like it's related, this idea of this spiritual emergency being this state of mind where you feel something, a presence or connectedness to something greater than yourself, but you don't know what it is, and you don't know how to deal with it. This weird, whatever energy is in you.
Yes. Well, there's a long sort of history of mystics being connected to sort of these kind of schizophrenic states. You know, they're very close. They're not the same, but those experiences are close together. And often what happens, in my opinion, in schizophrenia is that the ego is not developed enough to, in the first place. So when these breakthroughs happen, schizophrenia is a kind of breakthrough into that realm, right? In my opinion. But it generally takes a more developed, stronger ego to be able to come back from mystical experiences and integrate them into regular life. If you're having a schizophrenic experience, you're not integrating that very well, or you haven't integrated it yet. So yes, mystical unions can look like schizophrenic episodes. They can.
Yeah, because schizophrenia is, I mean, there's a whole host of sort of symptoms you could place on schizophrenia. A lot of it has to do with paranoia, and a lot of it is, I think, just that sort of not being able to function properly, not being able to socially relate to people around you in your situation.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I had one bad trip in my life, and that bad trip, it's you know, while I was in it. Actually, when I was coming out of it, I said, "Oh, this is what schizophrenia or psychosis probably feels like."
Right.
Yeah, and so and the reason I had that bad trip is that my ego, when it encountered that powerful energy that was manifesting through the psychedelic I took, it was ayahuasca. It was actually Santo Daime, so it was the daime. It was a version of the ayahuasca, and I experienced essentially madness, but. I knew that I was experiencing that because I was not giving up. I was not letting go of my identity. And so I could understand on several levels that my identity doesn't really exist. But at the same time, I was trying to hold on to that which doesn't exist.
Right.
And that gave rise to that experience of being just crazy, just absolutely psychotic.
Accept that as
yes.
Yeah.
And the thing is that bad trip turned into a good trip.
Really?
Eventually. Yeah, I was with a woman and she came in. I actually ran away from the ceremony.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the experience became so intense that I looked around and I could see that I recognized that everybody here is actually me.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm looking. See how you get to
everybody here is me, and I'm experiencing all of their energy. It's my energy, but I'm experiencing all of this energy is coming through me. And I didn't want to deal with that at the time. So I said, you know what, all of you guys, forget it. I'm out of here. I went to the restroom because my identity was gone by that point, but I almost gone. I could still sort of walk. I could barely walk. I was vibrating wildly. And I went to the restroom and I looked at myself. And there was a figure, right? There was a body, but there was no identity associated with it.
Oh, weird.
There's just nobody there. It was really freaky.
That's kind of scary, yeah.
Yeah, and so I sort of vibrating, barely somehow made it to my car. I even managed to turn on the heater somehow.
You were going to drive, were you? Oh, my God.
No, I wasn't going to drive, but I managed to turn because it was so cold. It's one of the things that there's weird temperatures, things that can happen. But I was so cold, and I turned on the heater, and I was just having this worst bad trip imaginable. I was in total hell. I cannot... unless somebody has been with that terror, they just don't know. It's just impossible to describe.
Right.
And so I was experiencing all sorts of things. I was this depraved animal. I was this reptile. I was human. I was God. But it was just so overwhelming that
there's so much unknown going on that you don't know what's
it's
going to be okay, or what's how you can be at the end of it all.
And it felt like an eternity. And it was just only beginning, right? It was about 30 minutes into the trip, and I was already in that state. And so the woman that was with me, she came in to the car to kind of look for me, and I was trying to tell her something, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't coherently make out sentences or words. And so she told me, at one point she said something like, "I gotcha," or "I love you." I don't remember exactly which it was. And suddenly it is as if the universe said, "I love you." Right? And so something in me I just let go. All of a sudden I was like, oh my God, it's so easy to let go. And so at that moment, when I let go, without thinking about it, without kind of deliberating that I had to let go, somehow I just let go.
Right.
And everything just turned inside out. It's like the universe, everything, my experience turned inside out. Everything became super geometrical. White light everywhere, fractals everywhere. Right. And I experience myself as being everything and everyone and everything that ever was, everything that ever will be. And so I was in that.
By the end of it.
It turned good by the end of it. It was the most beautiful, amazing thing.
It's funny how that comes up so much when people talk about this. Is it's about letting go. It seems like that comes up all the time. It's a terrible experience until you finally, and however it happens, you're able to go, okay, fine. Or somehow and just go, okay, fine then. I'm going to die. Fine, I'm going to die. And then it just all changes. And you're
and it has to be genuine. It's a just genuine decision. And every time it has happened to me, it hasn't been, it's no matter how much I tell myself, let go, let go, let go. It just, you get to that point, you get to that edge where you just have to jump off the precipice, and you do. Yeah. And for whatever reason, you do. And you just let go.
Right.
And and then everything changes.
Yeah, the only bad trip I've ever had was I tried salvia once. Yeah. I've only done it once, and I didn't have it wasn't a very good experience anyway. It was just kind of weird, but it was just so disassociative, and there was like a 2-minute stretch where I was just completely paranoid. I thought I had poisoned myself. And I wasn't confident in anything. I didn't even know who I was anymore. It was just like, for 2 minutes, I was just full panic. And then I think it just sort of started wearing off. And eventually I just came back and was like, oh my God, I'm never doing that again. But
yeah,
that was a weird one for me.
Yeah, that trip that I'm talking about, while I wasn't that, even when I came back from that trip, even though I let go, I said, I'm never doing this again.
Right. Yeah.
And I did it again.
Yeah,
lots
I'll probably try salvia at some point.
Yeah, it can make you feel, because it's terrifying. It really can be terrifying.
And I did actually, one of my first interviews on this podcast. It's an audio only interview, but I interviewed someone named Claire Ness who spoke about in college. I think she was only 19, maybe 20, and she tried LSD for the first time with a group of friends, and then basically, everyone else, their high on the LSD sort of faded out after a while. Hers just didn't fade, and she just stayed very high for a long, and then became very fearful, and ended up having sort of a schizophrenic episode, which lasted for, I think, at least a month, maybe months. And she was hospitalized and talked about how she couldn't feed herself, clothe herself, just was totally in this altered state that was not fun whatsoever. And I think there is some kind of link between these psychedelic type of drugs and these state of mind and things like schizophrenia. And I don't
there's actually been some studies where they would look at schizophrenics, the blood level of DMT in their blood, the level of DMT in their blood, and
like it is DMT in their blood?
Yeah, natural DMT, and it does seem to be increased. I mean, I can't really speak certainly about that, but there is definitely a connection there. They're also talking now about this sigma 1 receptor system that has to do with addiction and schizophrenia and things of that nature when it's not functioning properly. And DMT is one of the neurotransmitters that sort of one of the few neurotransmitters. DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, I believe. Maybe there's a couple of others, but they bind to this system. So it might. What I'm saying is, it might be involved in schizophrenia. There's definitely a connection there.
There's some sort of relation, I think. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't think it's just this. It's not some like cause and effect. Like these things cause schizophrenia or whatever. Clearly, lots of people are using these things and not being paranoid and schizophrenic and whatnot. But I do believe there's a connection. My father is schizophrenic. He was diagnosed schizophrenic very early. And so for me, there was always that sort of worry in the back of my mind, because you always heard that sort of idea that you take magic mushrooms and you're going to go. And that's what they when we were talking about like in mental institutions, they actually started using like LSD because they thought that by taking it, they would induce schizophrenia or psychosis in themselves, so then they would know what their patients were going through. That they kind of had that understanding of it early on, which I don't think is true whatsoever. I mean, maybe at least you get an altered state of mind. But I do think there's a connection, and like for me, marijuana too has been linked to schizophrenia, and I do believe if I smoke marijuana too frequently, well, it's not linked like cause and effect either.
No,
but
I think there's just people report feeling paranoid, it's schizophrenic. But
yeah, and I think there's some kind of relation between people who are schizophrenic tend to smoke more marijuana, but I'm thinking maybe that's sort of a medicinal sort of thing. It's not like
that doesn't seem right.
But I do believe that for me, I have sort of what would be described as schizophrenic type symptoms when I smoke too much pot, and it's nothing that's like overwhelming, but I have more of a voice in the back of my head telling me all the shit that I didn't do right, or all the shit that I feel bad about. It tends to come up more, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. For some people, it depends on on the strain of marijuana that you're using, right? I mean, there's so many strains now, but and whatever's in there. But for me, the effect generally is the opposite. I don't get sort of dissociative voices. I get this identification from my ego structures.
Right.
But maybe it's because of all the other tryptamines and how I've used. But I never get that. Never.
I've talked to other people who have different perspectives. Like I talked to one guy, Chris Homaker, who uses mushrooms very sort of shamanically, and talks about literally exorcising demons from people and whatnot. And he talks about schizophrenia literally being caused by demons within a person, and this kind of idea. And it's
that I'm not into that. To me, that's an overactive imagination and an overactive ego. Overactive imagination in the person who's casting out demons, and an overactive ego in a person who's and there are other mental problems. Obviously, I'm not denigrating that, but I mean that is one way to get rid of sickness, right? That's more of a shamanic model.
Yeah.
Of getting rid of sickness. Depends on how they do it, right? Getting rid of whatever the energetic kink block that is in your system. And that's one way of looking at it, because there are parts of us, right, or energy sometimes manifests as through these archetypal qualities of our mind, right? So we have kind of, sometimes we could say metaphorically or imaginatively that we have an angelic and demonic nature. There are primitive aspects of us that are more demonic, that would have that quality, that come with kind of that aggression and that intensity and fierceness, and maybe evil eye as well in there.
Right.
But to me, that's just manifestations of our psychology, of the energy patterns that we are, of the archetypes that exist within us.
Right.
Yeah, it's like
people like.
I don't take that literally as a metaphysical reality.
Right. It's a projection of trying to make sense of whatever is happening in a way, sort of thing. But because people talk about too, like, with the Sante Daime, they use ayahuasca and they use it through like a Christian sort of lens. And there are a lot of people who take, I think I spoke to Monica Kromhout, who was talking about someone, I think it was a kid who actually ended up killing himself, unfortunately, but he was talking about how he took, I think, mushrooms and had an experience of meeting Jesus. And for him, that was what happened. And he just then wanted to get back to that experience and meet Jesus again. So he ended up taking more and more mushrooms and mixing it with marijuana, which she thought contributed to whatever the hell happened. I think, it was a bad situation, but there's people who will have these type of experiences and then filter them through whatever sort of philosophy or maybe religion that they subscribe to, and things will come out. But I mean, I will just say that, and I've only had one experience ever where I thought that I had encountered something separate than myself in one of these experiences. It was when I took ayahuasca. I took it 4 times. The third time was sort of the biggest experience of them all. And in this experience, I had the experience of encountering 3 little spirits that were totally, I had never like heard of these things beforehand, and and then other people at this place talked about encountering these same little things and described them the same way.
Yes.
And so to me, that was pretty cool, and it wasn't something I had a preconceived notion of. So it was very interesting.
I remember listening to the podcast where you mentioned that to Martin Ball, and you talked about one
and
mind.
It was he had a similar take,
Yeah, that would be my perspective as well.
Right.
That it's just, there's this unified mind. There's this one integrated energy system, and we're just experiencing the same event from different perspectives, but it's still one mind.
Right.
You know, within that mind, there are multiple perspectives, multiple hub points, multiple localizations of experience, points of view.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's necessarily the truth of the matter, but it's so hard when you start getting into this kind of stuff, because then you can argue, you know, what is truth? Is reality real? Is this real? Am I real? Are you real? Like it's
well, this is the thing about it is, when the experiences that I've had, when they're really strong, they present themselves as unquestionable, right? It's just impossible to question what you're experiencing, because you understand at a very fundamental level of your experience that what you're experiencing is the truth. Now, for that to be really the case, that you could really trust that it's the truth, you'd have to let go of all your mental concepts in that experience, all the concepts of what you're experiencing, and just be with the unknown. And when all the detectors of all the filters fall away, right? When all the filters fall away, what is left over,
right, I think,
is generally the truth. You know, Philip K. Dick had this famous phrase: "Reality is that which is left over when you stop believing in it." Right. So to me, truth is sort of like that. Once you stop believing in everything, once you have all the concepts fall away, whatever's left over is the truth.
Yeah, no, I do like that.
Yeah, and generally, for me, for instance, when I've had those experiences where everything just fell away, all the concepts fell away, there was this level of understanding that's not an understanding with the mind. That what I'm experiencing, even I wouldn't even call it an experience, because at the highest level I've ever experienced is complete sort of void of experience. There is nothing there. Completely nothing. But within that nothing, there's this knowing or a feeling that I am.
Right. So Martin talked about this a little too, and he called it like an energetic reality. What feels real. And the only problem I have with that is like, can we trust our own perception though? Because if it feels real to us, does that mean it's real? And I'll just say, like, as an example, say I'm back when I was 15 years old, and maybe I was in a period of my life where I was super depressed, and my perception of my reality was that I was a loser and that I was bound to be nothing but a failure, and So for me, that was my energetic reality at the time, was that there's nothing good is ever going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. But that wasn't actually the case in the long run. So I feel like possibly we are still too immature to actually know. And just because we feel something as the truth, even a deep down sort of core type of truth, it doesn't necessarily mean we can trust that even.
Yeah, well, that's true only to the extent that when our identity is present, that is true. When this sense of individuality, of a separate being is present, that is absolutely true. But say all your sense of being who you are, a distinct individual, dissolves, right? And within that, the regular detectors of what is true and untrue dissolve as well, right? And so what you left over there is not the regular feeling of that you have of your identity, because when you're trying to figure out what the truth is, when you're not so dissolved,
right? So
when you're trying to figure, then all you're doing is you're just combining concepts, and you're basing truth on those concepts. right? Uh, and even perceptions are sort of filtered through the concepts. But say all the concepts fall away, and you cannot and you're in a state where you cannot even say that it is you as a separate individual that's perceiving anything, but you're just this feeling that is left over. Everything falls away and there's a feeling. So we're not talking about a feeling that you regularly have of your body, mind, of your emotions, of your thoughts. You're talking about a different kind of feeling. And yeah, and that's a different level. So I think when Martin talks about feeling, he doesn't talk about, we filter our feelings through our thoughts, through our beliefs.
For sure. And through words.
A lot of our emotions are determined by our beliefs, by we believe deep down. But when those beliefs are gone, those emotions are gone as well. So we're not feeling the emotions anymore. We're feeling a kind of energy. And it's not me anymore, right? It's not, I can't even say, like in my biggest experience, I can't say that Serge, right, had an experience, that I had an experience. No, it was just experience happening by itself. It was just that flow state. Right. And so when we're talking about feeling, when Martin talks about feeling, I think I would translate it into my terms is that he's talking about a flow state. It's like, it's not, yeah, he's like, you're not talking about what I feel. It's when that sense of I is gone, what is flowing through me, that's the feeling, right? Because what is flowing at that moment is pure feeling. When you're in a flow state, there's pure feeling. There is no thought about it, it's just feeling flowing, right? And within that flowing feeling, there's a knowing. There's a knowing, right? And so there's kind of these discriminations that we can make as we go deeper into the experience. Right. And so those discriminations can tell us that we're not experiencing truth at a conceptual level. We're experiencing truth at the fundamental ontological level of reality. We're not talking about, it's not a question anymore of how do I know, right? Philosophically, there's this, we're talking about epistemology, that word. How do we know what we know, right? How can we really be sure that what we know is true? Mm-hmm. That consideration falls away because knowing and being come together in the flow state.
I understand you can like feel that. I always withhold a tiny bit of that. It could all just be bullshit. Like it could all just be a trick of some kind. I don't know. I still and maybe that's because I've never experienced that. Like these complete non-dual states of mind. I have never.
Yeah, well, so up until this experience that I was telling you about, that was my first experience of non-duality, right? So for somebody like me, and maybe for an individual like yourself, the intellect is the guardian at the gate until the intellect truly accepts that this is true, right? It's just until the intellect can make sense of it.
Right.
Lots of us just won't accept it. So I was the same way. I wouldn't accept it. To me, these non-duality God, up until it was about 4 years ago that it really happened. I didn't care for those terms, right? I was kind of an intellectual, I would describe myself, right? And a rationalist. I wouldn't say I was an atheist, but close. Right. I was somewhat of a Buddhist, maybe something like that. But it is through these experiences that it broke my intellect, that I could see that it wasn't with the intellect that I had to know, that I couldn't know this reality with the intellect, and that if I ever try to think about it, it is bullshit, because the mind cannot grasp it.
Understand rationally.
You can't understand
put it into a coherent this and this and this equals this.
And personally, what I found out is that just about everything my intellect thinks about the experience is bullshit.
Right. And that's we are filtered by our words and our language. We can only understand things so much as our language allows us to express it, even in our own heads or not.
Yes.
So there's a limit, but I still withhold, because I heard this idea a lot too of just the unexplainable, the unimaginable, people just putting out there that we just can't understand it. Where humans just can't. And I just think I don't accept that. I think
I don't accept that either.
Maybe we can, even just in our current, if it's explained well enough. And this is sort of the funny thing I have with some of these psychedelics things too, especially when people call them divine God experiences. And I feel like if this is really God and it's really ourselves and we're trying to explain things, can't we do it in a more simple, direct way? Why is this psychedelic weird fairy creature over here, and then this weird da da da? It's like so hard to explain.
I don't know which psychedelic you're using, but with 5-MeO DMT, it's been pretty clear to me.
Yeah.
Every time. Yeah. And so it just for me it left no doubt. And it was a process too. It was personally, right? I'm not saying that you have to believe what I believe, but for me, at least it was a process to get that level where I would come out of the experience and I would think about it and I would say, well, it could all be bullshit. Like I'm just this can't be right. Like I'm just imagining it. And then I would go back into the experience and I would realize, no, it's actually the opposite. I'm bullshitting myself when I'm thinking about it so much, when I'm trying to analyze, when I'm trying to make sense of it. And when I go back to the experience, it presents itself with such certainty, with undoubtable certainty. And that it was just impossible to deny at a certain point. So that's my personal experience, and that's the only place I can speak from.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we'll see one day. We'll know for sure at some point. I guess. I hope.
Well, I say we all say yes at the end. Right. Yeah. It's like we all go into the great unknown at the end. It's just a matter of some of us appear to experience it in the here and now, what awaits us after we pass into the great beyond, but some of us never get to experience that.
And these things, it's always fun to debate and sort of talk about this stuff. And I just want to point out two things. Like one, I think, like no matter what these things are, they can be really helpful for people. These types of experiences can lead to so much beneficial things for people. It's really ridiculous that they're illegal for people to use. It's just bullshit. It could really change so much. I can, but I also want to point out that they can be so dangerous too. Like I talked about, people have had schizophrenic breaks after trying things and not having the right supports for themselves, or not being in the right environments, or being with people who do not have their best interest at heart.
Right.
So people have to be very careful as well.
People have to be very careful. These are powerful tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are powerful tools, and in the wrong hands, they can be very destructive indeed. Yeah.
And so, is there anything that you'd like to promote, or can people contact you in any way if they want to reach out?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I thought I would have my website up by now, but I'm revamping my website, and maybe you can link it up later on when my website is back up.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe if people are interested, they can contact me through you. But at the moment, I don't. My website would be the main way to.
Do you know what the address will be when it is up?
Yeah, it would be tryptamineawakenedintimacy.com.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a long name, but
right. Is that like related? Are you're writing a book as well on this subject?
Yes. I'm writing a book on the subject.
Okay.
And and I'm beginning to speak before it's all done. It's in the editing phase, where a lot of these ideas are discussed in greater detail.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, I love it. The idea of breaking it down to a sort of flow state, I think, is a really useful way of looking at it, because it does take away some of these other things that are a little too crazy for people to consider. This when you start talking about non-duality and God, and that's really what I would like to see more of, is people trying to bridge that gap between the sort of ultra hippie ideals and the
that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do with that idea. Yeah. Exactly.
All right. That's awesome, man. Thanks so much for talking to me, man. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me.